Hello, everybody. My name is John Broad. I'm one of the co-founders and the CMO here at Rome. It's awesome to have you here. Welcome. I have been looking forward to this discussion. It combines two of, as we know, the most important workplace topics there are: distributed team design and AI, and also includes some of my favorite people in the industry. It's our fourth future of work discussion in Rome, and I think it's going to be great. I really do have a warm spot for this community. Quick note on format: super simple, 40 minutes of moderated discussion followed by audience Q&A. That's you. At any point, please throw questions in the chat in the lower right. You can access that. Or react. Many of you have started to do reactions. Those are the icons at the bottom of the screen. You can thumbs up, you can laugh, you can clap. Try resisting throwing tomatoes. I know it's not always easy. Also, we've got this little microphone ask a question area where you can literally just click into that and then ask an audio question that everybody will hear. And then just after you ask the question, remember to bounce back to the audience so that the next person can come up. So do that at any time. So thrilled to have this exclusive discussion in Rome with this world-class team: Phil Kirschner, Darren Murph, Corinne Murra are thought leaders and visionaries in the space. They need no introduction, so I will in fact not give them one. I will simply welcome Phil, Darren, and Corinne to the stage. But before I do, a quick word from our sponsor, Rome.
Welcome to the Office of the Future. Rome is a virtual office that lets everyone in your company work as if you were in one room, but from anywhere. So collaboration is super fast, productivity is super high, and meetings last on average just 8 minutes long. Now, speaking of 8, Rome also includes 8 apps in our all-in-one virtual office super bundle. Apps like Magic Apps, which let you send a video clip to anybody you like, or Lobby, which lets you send a scheduling link out, and our AI Inbox, which lets you chat with anybody, groups, threads, replies, all powered by AI. Now, speaking of AI, over the next few years, every business is either going to become an AI business or be disrupted by one. And Rome is fully enabled by AI, starting with our AI note taker, Magic Minutes, so you can get a recap and prompt any meeting that you've been in. Everyone in Rome also gets an Onnit, which is an AI assistant. You get your own AI assistant that can schedule meetings, that can follow up, that can send emails, that you can prompt about what you've had. You can chat with your AI, and they can do all kinds of tasks, all in the name of making you ultra productive for the future. Nobody knows what the future holds, but I do know this: it's going to be built in a Rome virtual office, hopefully by you.
Hello, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces in the crowd. Chris Muller, always can count on you to be giving us emojis and amping us up. We're just gonna wait for Darren to make his way over, and in the meantime, many of you know who I am. I'm Corinne Murra, workplace strategist, work futurist, and author of Work Then Place, which I know many of you have already purchased and sung high praises for, including this one here. So,
which you should buy.
Thank you all for that support. That's been really wonderful for me and Sarah Escobar. And we have my good friend Phil Kirschner, who I will let you say your quick highs.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet some friends in the audience. Welcome to my office. This is fun, actually, as a Rome user, to have you all in the auditorium that I'm otherwise hanging out by myself. Looking forward to Darren getting over his video problems, but I'm a modern work consultant. Most people know me from most recently having been at McKinsey and WeWork prior to that. I also created a newsletter called The Work Line that I've been running for about a year now, writing about all things modern work, including Rome and this balance of kind of physical and digital behaviors with an eye on AI. Oh, we keep losing Darren. He's like coming and going. But that's me. And just speaking strictly as someone who's going to be on the receiving end of this conversation, Corinne is possibly the best positioned to be moderating with two people who come staunchly from the office and from remote land. As it's, it is not, this is all an and conversation, not an or, right?
Yeah.
For thinking about distributed work with an eye on AI.
Yeah, for me personally, I think what's so prescient about this conversation is that for me, my first experience with hybrid and having distributed teams was 10, 12 years ago. We got so for me, I've always operated in a hybrid or distributed mindset. So figuring out how do we make that built environment powerful, but how do we make sure that the digital environment doesn't just exist to support what's happening in the physical environment, but stand alone and integrate and create a more holistic experience regardless of where people are working from and how they're doing the work. So, and with that, I will hand it off to the remote oracle himself, Mr. Murph.
Hey all, thanks for joining today. I'm looking forward to this discussion. If you're not aware of my work, I worked with GitLab for many years to help it become the world's first fully distributed company to IPO. And so I'm all about systems, what kind of culture and tooling systems can we build in order to enable people to not only do great work, but maybe more importantly, live great lives from anywhere in the world. And so excited to dive into this conversation. And Corinne, thanks for moderating and leading us today.
My pleasure. So I think even though it is, the years are going on, even though time seems to still be standing still in many ways, let's rewind the clocks a bit. So back to before 2020 or early 2020. So, 7 years ago kind of thing. Before the pandemic broke, and we were still in this sort of like ever upward, future of work. We're going to be going. I happen to know what the two of you were working on. You did just mention it, but at that moment, I knew what you both were working on, partly because Phil, you and I were at WeWork together, different teams, but highly reliant on one another. And Darren, I remember printing out the GitLab the GitLab remote playbook because there were so many, core principles about what you had built there that made sense for what I was focused on within activity-based working and organizational redesign that were relevant regardless of where the bodies were. And so that was my snapshot of, let's call it January of 2020. But at the time, were either of you really sort of aware or gearing what you were working on towards what we would now call a future of work problem? Or did it just feel like it was the right thing to do based on what, the conditions you were operating in?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start. So the short version, I come from the world, like you, kind of sort of physical workplace strategy. I got started at a large bank that, generally speaking, for the first time ever asked people what they thought of their time in the office. And surprise, surprise, pre-COVID, unbeknownst to most executives, if you asked most people how they felt about the space that they were doing most of their work most of the time, the answer was not great.
Right.
So I think we were trying to block and tackle and solve that problem largely through moving people into more diverse environments and getting them to learn how to share so that they could, surprise, surprise, adjust where they were physically working to match what they were actually doing, or where they were physically sitting based on what they were actually doing. And maybe with an eye on Darren's answer, as part of the change management program that we were running, when I would tell someone, listen, you're never here, or you're not all here all the time, I lean specifically into when you are not here. I personally, in this moment, despite my feelings about remote work, maybe as a future pathway or as a part of what we think of the future work, I don't care what you're doing when you're not here. And I am not trying to change any of those patterns when you're not here. It is not my job to help you work remotely more or better in this moment. That was very much, I think, a lot of my colleagues in the industry saying, we're aware of this. And that is in part why some of you are not here all the time, but it is hard enough to get you unglued from that desk of yours with that name and the storage and the photo that we'll sort of stay here. So that was the very simple version maybe of my pre-COVID life, with the WeWork overlay of spaces can be better if they're more hospitality oriented, more community oriented, but the root problem was the same. Most people's physical environments weren't supporting most of their work most of the time, no matter who they were. And I did not know about Darren or GitLab, right? That was like very much off of my radar.
Wait. This is important. I beat you to something.
You did, totally.
I have a story from early on in that era. And so actually, I'll back up a bit before GitLab. So the first kind of half of my career was actually in editorial, and I helped build a globally distributed newsroom. And so we had editors, we had designers, we had engineers across 6 continents. And we were doing something that most people thought to be impossible, which was competing with the likes of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times with a team that was built all around the world. And there weren't any tools, pre-built off-the-shelf tools in order to achieve this. And so we actually had to hire engineers and then tell this person what we wanted to build. And we kind of built early tooling for enabling this to happen. Now, fast forward to the GitLab era, there were many more off-the-shelf tools that would help us do this. But when I recognized that COVID was going to be a real thing and it was going to force people to do things very, very differently. I was actually at a coffee shop in San Francisco, had just finished a meeting. And the first piece of work that I did after that was to open up a page and write what not to do when transitioning to remote work. That was the first thought that came to mind. And the reason for this is I had worked in enough different environments over the years to know that the conventional line of thinking, the default way of thinking, was so counter to how you needed to think when you viewed work not necessarily as a physical location, but a series of connected events and communications that enabled a result to be derived, that I was concerned that most of the world would glom to their defaults and then just do it from home. And it would be kind of at worst an unmitigated disaster, but even at best, it would be not fully taking advantage of the environment. And so my my first order of business was to tell people as loudly as I could what not to do so that they actually stood a chance at evolving into a system of what to do.
Yeah.
There's such a parallel there, just thinking back, like any company that has tried to move to a more, just call it open, flexible, fluid, whatever the variation is on when we are here together, we are kind of moving around differently. Anyone who holds on to that old way is like, I'm going to try to dedicate this space to me for something that wasn't built for that purpose, is a complete mismatch in the environment, physical or otherwise, and the actual way of work. It's a recipe for disaster, exactly as you said.
Yeah, it's a funny. It was, I mean, obviously, this is not revelatory. It was such an inflection point. And, Sophie Wade, who I know is in the audience, like when she and I talk about it, we say like the future of work happened in 2020. That was just, there was a before and after. But there was this sort of like odd incubation period of like year 1 of the future of work had very distinct notes. Year 2 had very distinct notes. So in 2020, in that first year, Darren, what is it that you think, based on what shouldn't organizations do when they go fully remote? What were the things that organizations were getting the most wrong? From my observation, I was seeing a lot of what I think is still probably the biggest challenge is people using spare time to fill up with meetings. So sort of like the busy work of digital presenteeism in a way. But I'd love to know, on the ground, those times, like what were you really observing and seeing as like, oh no, I wish people would stop doing that.
Yeah, 2 things that were at the top of that chart. One is meetings are the default way that work gets done. And so they simply ported what would have been an in-office meeting to a virtual meeting. And they did not stop to ask, is this meeting even necessary? And if it is, do we have the right meeting hygiene around it? Can we record this? Is there a note taker? The list goes on and on. They just defaulted to moving it from physical to virtual. And the second one was a continued lack of appreciation for documentation. And it segues really nicely into the topic for today's discussion. I maintained at the time that documentation was the remote work superpower. For companies that actually had a rigor around writing down the way that you worked and codifying things that would otherwise just be in the ether or just be lost was the foundation for learning to happen, for growth to happen, for innovation to happen. And you can see, if you look back through that era, the strongest teams, not just remote teams, but the strongest teams in general were the ones that got serious about writing things down. It made communication easier. It makes growth easier. And now in the era of AI, the companies that actually took the time to get serious about documentation have an incredibly robust data set for AI to do something with. And for the companies that said, no, 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 we're okay with just continuing to verbalize meetings and not record them and, in one ear and out the other, it has nothing to work with. And so to some degree for the remote work advocates that were saying, no, documentation is important. It is an interesting moment now where we say it was important and now it's even more important. But a lot of companies got that wrong.
Yeah, you get to really cash that check now. Phil, in terms of, executive assumptions, like what were some of the biggest disconnects that you were seeing?
Yeah, I mean, what was really fascinating for me in that moment was going from, we work in real estate world where most of the effort was to get a conversation with like the CFO or they had a real estate someone who was running it, but opportunistically being at McKinsey, I was thrust into like the C-suite entirely and dragged by my colleagues to talk to, I don't even know how many hundreds of CEOs about like, what do I do in this moment? And it became abundantly clear, terrifyingly, that, every executive who had ever renovated a bathroom once was certain they knew how their office pre-COVID had been performing, both in how many people were around, what they thought about that, what outcomes it had like on the people in the organization. They were like absolutely certain. And shockingly, a lot of my own colleagues who came from like traditional corporate McKinsey were like, yes, that must have been true. And this all thankfully to me like led to me getting hired. But I'm like, there's this huge body of knowledge and a whole discipline around understanding what people think about the place where we work when we choose to be somewhere beyond our home. And for that first year, it was still very much around safety and the things that Dan's been talking about, making us effective, like when we're mostly apart. But all of the assumption about what's going to happen when we come snapping back together for most organizations, at least part of the time, were based on fallacies. And Corinne, I know you and me and several people in the audience here were always like, warning, timeout. This isn't going to go well. And I used to sum it up just that, employees, we don't like to go to bad restaurants twice. And most offices are bad restaurants we used to have to go to, but now we don't. And obviously some people have overcome that with, or tried to overcome it with, I'm going to make you or else, but that is a whole other webinar into itself. But really it was the confidence that I know what was happening before, even though I know they weren't looking. It's not, you didn't care because they didn't think it mattered, but now very much.
It's Dunning-Kruger.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So I want to make sure that we are, we're getting to the punchline and getting to what we're talking about with digital collaboration and all this kind of stuff. But I want to just, Phil, give you a second to talk about the Organizational Health Index and how that came to be and what role that plays in sort of, me talking about like each year since 2020 has had its own flavor. This came out in 2022. What went into it in terms of publishing it, and then what was sort of the tale of introducing it, talking about it, and its influence once it was out in the world?
Yeah, this is the most important thing that I continue to talk about since I was at and left McKinsey, with anyone who will listen, about remote, hybrid, whatever you want, but also AI. So the real kind of meeting of the minds for Darren and I, while I was at McKinsey, being asked by countless CEOs, what is the best version of hybrid? That was always the question. What version of hybrid will lead to the highest employee experience? And I would always say like that, you cannot answer that question because two employees with identical everything, except maybe two different bosses, one will have a great experience because their boss is great and the others is a jerk. And so they have a terrible experience. It doesn't matter what the office looks like, any of these other things. And so there's no real test, especially coming from the real estate world, that is going to objectively measure the performance of the kind of work operating system choices of these companies, because every individual employee's little daily fingerprint is so unique. The choices that they make, how far they commute, who's their boss, what's their gender, do they have kids, blah, 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 endless. But I realized in having met Darren and some other remote leaders, like Those companies that were born remote have everything is the same. People were hired into an environment where they're at home. The documentation is excellent. Like the expectation was there from the beginning. It is not an accident. And everybody has had an opportunity to set up their own environment. So I said, let's test them. And Darren and I worked to get GitLab and some other companies through what McKinsey calls their organizational health index. It is the survey that has been supporting most of their biggest reports for the last 20 years on the success of large-scale corporate transformation, culture, change management. If you've read any article of McKinsey since like 2000, it guaranteed has been using that data. But really importantly, even with thousands of companies benchmarked by one of the world's largest management consultancies, that survey, when Darren and I did this little work together, didn't even have a question in it about where do you work physically in terms of the upfront demographics. But that didn't matter because for GitLab, the answer was the same for everybody. So long story short, after we put GitLab through the OHI, the exact same survey that had been used for like 20 years on all sorts of normal, big, stodgy companies that were anything but like GitLab, we were surprised to find out that they were a top decile performer, top 10% over thousands of companies overall, over like better than top 10%, sometimes 100th percentile on more than half of the management practices that are in the survey. And the big one that really like knocked the socks off of my colleagues that live in that data all the time was how unbelievably well they performed on things like process and documentation transparency and role clarity, all the stuff that comes from what Darren said. Yeah. Everything gets written down. There's no trusting individual managers to communicate how work is done, the culture, the objectives, like what's important, how you have a meeting, all of that, because it was so transparent. And that really was like the catalyst for this level of performance. And we were later able to prove that behaving, let's say, in a remote friendly way, not only led to employees perceiving the company having a very positive like work environment, but thinking more highly of leadership's ability to kind of set a strategy for the firm that is, in its best interest, all because of that underlying performance. And that really was the wake-up call for me about like, I'm not trying to tell every company in the world to be remote, but there's so much to learn from the consistency and the transparency and the commitment to working from an intentional operating system, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, I love hearing you guys talk about this because it proves, I think, what most of us here and in the audience already know, which is creating that clarity, creating that structure isn't limiting. It's actually the thing that unlocks what makes work enjoyable, or just if it's not going to be enjoyable, it's going to be at least smooth and as frictionless as possible. And so, Darren, I want to just point this to you, and I think in some ways it must have been a little bit of a, well, yeah, duh, we did this for a reason. And now, now there's McKinsey data that backs up all of our reasoning and all of our hypotheses. But yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what were some of the more heart-centered reasoning, like, what was the heart-centered basis for a lot of these choices? Because and this is very dear to me, because I, like Phil, I come from physical workplace, which evolved into employee experience. And then once you start thinking about employees, you start thinking about people and psychology and behavior. And we, collectively with employee experience tend to over-index on like, just like the swag and this sort of like the cultural confetti, but it has no substance towards how people get their work done. And I posit, and I lean on this, and I know you guys do too, that really caring about and building for the employee experience is building for the good work experience. And then that's the good culture. The good culture gets built on that. So Darren, I'd love to just, give you the mic, and I want to hear more about like, what was that logic? What were those drivers for you particularly and as a leadership team?
So Dale Carnegie has this famous quote that respect is the bedrock of motivation. And we knew early on that when you can create an intentional work environment where people get to choose where they are when they're contributing their genius to a professional firm, it's the ultimate sign of respect, and it goes both ways. There's reciprocity that happens in that environment. And distributed work done well enables a company to find the best people anywhere in the world. And regardless of what their situation is, if they can build a comfortable environment for themselves and they can have access to the internet, they can contribute. This was very personal for me. I lived in a relatively rural part of the United States, certainly not in Silicon Valley, but always had a passion for contributing to companies that were birthed out of that Silicon Valley mindset, by the way. It's not necessarily the place, but there's a mentality around that that always interested me. And also, I'm an adoptive dad, and I look back at our adoption journey and I think how easy that journey was because I worked on a flexible team where needing to go do something on a Wednesday afternoon when a facility was open was not an issue. My team understood that I could work flexibly or have a nonlinear workday. And these are the kinds of things that honestly you take for granted when you're working in a distributed environment instead of that rigid 9 to 5 where the commute defines your life and then you have to live around the fringes of that. And this was just such a more healthy way to think about integrating work and life. And for someone that's in it, it's obvious, but obvious things are only obvious to those who are already in it. And so part of the mission was and continues to be to shine a light to others that maybe haven't seen this, that enables them to have that epiphany or that aha moment. And when they realize that a work can be architected differently, such that some of the things that I have internalized as must-dos actually aren't. They're actually optional. And tooling and AI and digital communication, if used in the right way, can actually build a workplace operating system that enables you to have a lot more flexibility on not only where you are, but when work happens. Now, none of this is without a lot of work, but the thing that I would argue and share with leaders is you're going to spend energy either way. You can spend energy trying to enlist mandates to get everyone back to an office, even though they've already had a taste of what different looks like. Or you could spend that energy in truly evolving and iterating your culture and how you work and your tool stack and build towards the future. There's no easy button here. You're not getting out of this without spending any energy. So I would advise put that energy towards the future, not pulling back and bringing people back into the past.
The only way out is through. So we're leaning into really the premise of why we're here and talking about not just the systems and the behaviors, but the actual things that enable us to do the work, which is something like a Roam and what these tools are capable of. But before we dive in there, Tyler, I know you're at the mic,
Waiting patiently.
Waiting very patiently. So thank you for that. And floor is yours.
Yeah. I'm just pressing all the buttons. That's me. Software experimenter John, said, "Hey, go up to the front." So I'm here listening, but yeah, when it makes sense to actually call on somebody from the audience, please do.
Okay, so now we know that the button works. Anyone who wants to come up, thank you, Tyler. I think you need to sit back down. Yeah, there you go. Now, Phil, you're at the mic. Do you have something to say? Well, once he gets back, we'll really get into, hearing more about Roam, sort of like the digital workplace, and not just the digital workplace of in the sense of it's a collection of tools that enable us to do work, but as an actual destination. And, for me, this is my first time in Roam. However, this is sort of like the next evolution of what initially was the metaverse during, the Web3 era. Was that 2021 or 2022? Time doesn't make sense to me anymore. But, this is a much more accessible and dynamic way to, be congregated. And so, Phil, I want to hear more about how you think something like this enables a workplace strategy, and this is stuff that is on my mind all the time now in my current role, but really I'd love to hear how you are seeing other organizations integrate things like this as an extension of what would have been a more traditional workplace strategy?
Yeah, I mentioned my newsletter, and one of the early articles that took off in ways that I wasn't really expecting was I said, look, like all CEOs care where work happens. The problem is that we always think we say where, and we think like, oh, it's an office. But what hanging out with people like Darren and that whole OHI process really taught me was it's about this like delicate balance of consistency and sort of peripheral vision. And I loved, like, I sort of fell in love with Rome immediately because it had this like subtle element of physicality to it. I told you guys on the way in, like being in another one of these calls and having someone from the stage be able to like say, oh, I see people in the audience, or I see you talking to each other. But balancing that with the belief, and like Corinne, you and I, we had this experience at WeWork. Even when you're in the office together, even when people are moving around, I think it got very automatic for us to be like, I'm always opening Zoom, I'm always opening Mira, I'm always opening whatever the tool is that we have intentionally chosen is the place where some body of work happens, and it stays there. It's very consistent. And whether it's a full workplace experience or like a room, or just saying, oh yes, we use WhatsApp for really urgent things, but it can't just be me and Darren deciding that for us. It's got to be everybody, because with an eye on like what the real future of work is, when you go beyond hybrid, beyond AI, these sort of topics that are on the horizon, you get things like skills-based organizations and resourcing, where more companies will have more employees feeling more like they're almost in consulting, like week over week or day over day. I don't just work for one person on one thing. I might be gigging internally with a couple different groups on a couple different things. And if each one of those groups has its own little ways of working, it is so cognitively abusive that we won't be able to handle it. Yep. And like AI will help, but you have to sort of say these things happen in these places and mean a combination of we go to the office for these activities, and when we're doing our project updates, no matter where you are in this world physically, we're in Rome communicating in that room that we always go to. Like, having that balance.
Darren, in terms of that, from a remote standpoint, I think this is relevant for physical teams too, but I think more important for remote teams in terms of everyone's going to have their own idiosyncrasies. So how do you index for that without flattening everything into no, this is the law and this is how it must be done?
Yeah, this is the ultimate balance, but also it's something that I'm the most optimistic about. When I guide companies through this transition, I lay out a federal and state level of thinking.
Nice.
And this is something that most anyone can understand. Like, for example, in the United States, if you have a driver's license, it was administered to you by the state that you live in, but it actually works federally. Mm-hmm. You can operate that vehicle federally. Well, how is that? Well, it's because federally it was decided that roads and signs work a certain way. So you can't just go to one state and say, we're just going to pop up this sign and embed it into our driving test, and it's not anywhere else. But there are some idiosyncrasies within the states, and getting that balance is where the magic is at. And like Phil mentioned, there's got to be some alignment on these federal level guidelines of this is how work gets done. For example, if we use a certain tool for communication or a certain tool for project management, we can't have engineering or legal or communication popping up their own tool and using it. Today, the interesting thing of why I'm optimistic about this is if you look in the software engineering world, there used to be this big issue around you have to code things in a certain language. So if you come work for us, we use this. We use React or Python or whatever the case may be. And if you are sufficient in another language, you might not be a fit here. But what's interesting, just like cell phones now, you could have two people talking in two different languages and it automatically translates. I actually think that in the future of work, there may actually be a possibility where micro teams can have those differences, and then there is a massive installation that happens around the collective or the hive mind that actually actively translates between the two. Yeah. Now, as someone with a background in editorial, I am of two minds with this, because on one hand it says, well, this gives you an excuse to kind of ignore taxonomy and hygiene and actually doing it the right way. But on the other hand, if technology is going to help us to communicate in the language that's most native to us and get along with our colleagues better, who am I to argue? And so for now, I would say it is really important to get the federal guidelines around, for example, we document here, because no amount of translation is going to happen if you don't actually put it somewhere first. And then within the state level agreements, you can say, okay, as long as there's a mechanism for seamlessly translating from one team to another, we're okay with that. And that gives you some amount of leeway and flexibility at a state level.
Yeah,
It's kind of like it's sort of an API way of thinking for like the more technical, or like you guys can do whatever you want inside the machine.
right.
But you
it's game
must
theory within game theory.
Yeah, there must be instructions on the outer layer so that any other team knows the basics of how to interact with you, and how the sausage gets made you can do like at a nuclear state level. Yeah.
Now I do have something to say. Just that what Darren was talking about of like having the cell phones like doing the translation layer, and like what Phil's saying about the API like kind of conversation. Like I went so far down the rabbit hole with like just figuring out this kind of stuff. Like that's the stuff that I do all the time now, is that kind of like translation between different tools, or or migrations from one set to another, like that kind of data level stuff is what you all have identified a long time ago, right? And I think is like, the future of the future, right? Is that stuff where some of that comes along for the ride, even done by agents, right? Instead of a Tyler, right?
Tyler bot, yeah. Corinne, sorry, I cut you off. You were going to ask another
No,
question.
no, that's okay. I think we're trending in the right direction. Before we move forward, are there any other questions people want to come to the mic with? Otherwise, we're just going to keep going.
Keep on trucking.
We have someone.
Olivia?
You might be on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
1 second. Okay.
Better.
Sorry. This is cool. I've used Roam before, but I haven't used this feature, so I'm trying to navigate all this. But my question is, I work for a very large organization, and there isn't sometimes some direction from the federal state, right? And so we kind of have to come up with our own solution. Mm-hmm. And is there like any advice on, we may not be able to add to our tool stack right now, but like how we use the resources that we have right now to create the best experience that we can with the limitations that some of those tools have to offer.
Totally.
Yeah,
I think you're doing the right thing first anyway. Before you add new, you have to know what you currently have, what your core competencies are, and what you need. Like this is, I wrote a book about it, but basically you're right. Don't add until you know what you need.
The other thing that I would advise here is you have an opportunity to use ambiguity as a feature, not a bug. I know what you mean. You're like, I wish this was just clear and the structure was set from on high so that our teams were empowered to know what the guardrails are. But in an instance when they're not, that's actually preferred to, well, it's been set from on high, but I just vehemently disagree with it. If there's ambiguity, you can say, all right, we're going to build a team agreement. And there are so many resources around great team agreements. Atlassian builds a template. There's a bunch of templates. If you just Google Gemini, team agreement template, start there and start being the change that you want to see by saying, as a team, we're going to codify how we're doing this and how we're solving it. And here are the ways that we're using the tools that are used in the organization. And here's where we want it to go. And I've actually seen this work. It works best from top down. But what you're talking about is kind of bottoms up, whereas we build this team agreement, and when we start sharing it with other teams, also share the template. You may even kind of create this micro learning and development environment where other teams are like, oh my goodness, this clarity, like we can use this for our team. How do we do this? I can't promise that it's going to solve everything overnight, but there is something magical about saying we're going to do the best with what we have, and we're going to codify it so that we can share it with others, and then they have on hand how we're doing it. At least you are contributing to some amount of shared understanding in that process.
Yeah, well, I would say, like, for clients I work with on, let's just say, meeting culture at its simplest, when they go, no, we couldn't possibly, we have so many. Even you say, look, maybe a third of the work that someone does is their tiny little nuclear team, and another third is their slightly larger circle department, and then another third is the things influenced by the whole company. If you just work on the third, as Darren said, like the things you can control, that's still a lot of people's time, it's a lot of their experience, a lot of their output, and then it could be infectious, really.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll keep nerding out. We got 15 minutes, right? Okay. So, we're talking around AI. We're talking about tools that enable collaboration, sort of codify new ways of working or enable existing ways of working in new and more dynamic ways. But, the elephant in the room with AI is always about quality. And it's about the quality of what we get from AI. And, if you have garbage data, you get garbage AI results. And so, Darren, this sort of points to what you talked about at the very beginning of like the documentation and the codification. Creating your own source of truth then enables whatever AI is providing for you to sort of capitalize on that. And so there's a little bit of time and time investment required, but also I don't know, kind of there's this element of you are able to sort of stretch as an organization, or even just if you're operating within a team, to do more than what you thought, just because you have a foundation. So the foundation lists not only not have that sort of permutation benefit, but they also don't have the time investment under their belt already. So Darren, I want to talk to you a little bit more about just how you are seeing organizations right now, either one, try and play catch up and build that foundation and, build that sort of that time investment. And the ones that have had the time investment, what are the surprises that they're coming, what are the surprises that are coming up for them in, we never really thought that we'd be here, but because we did this, we're finding out X, Y, Z.
Working with an organization right now on building what we're calling their org brain. And essentially what they have found is they have 3 different product lines, 3 different businesses, and in many ways they operate very, very differently from one another. But they've realized that in order to scale, they have to implement a federal level org brain in order for people to know what each other are doing. And what I really compliment this company on is they are doing what I call the first mile schlep. And if you look at any of the great AI frontier labs, when they go into organizations, the first thing they do is prevent them from implementing an AI tool right away. They first have to audit and say, what is actually here to work with? If you just put AI into a void, it's just going to hallucinate. Do you want more hallucinations in your workplace? Hopefully not. And so what they're doing is they're saying, well, where is the information that we have? How do we validate it? What of this information do we trust? Where is it all at? And we're taking inventory of all of this. And then we're saying, okay, now what is the best tool or tools to put on top of this? And what foundational documentation do we need to have in place before this can actually do anything? Look, you can't build a skyscraper without excavating the job site, right? Like if you actually want this building to stand firm and stand the test of time, you actually have to do some work on the foundational level. And I think that the hype around AI is like, oh, great, we can just put this on a terrible foundation and it's going to be the thing that it's not. It's just not helpful. And organizations that are doing it right are actually taking a step back and they're spending 3 to 6 months building a decent foundation in order to pay dividends going forward.
Yeah. And Phil, are you, in terms of patterns or things that you are, or examples that you're seeing in your own client work, what's the sort of change journey with executives to get them to accept that they have to rewind a bit before they go forward and sort of like, lunge into, AI and, that future of work that, they need to be retrospective and create or reinforce data governance structures that they would otherwise prefer to ignore?
Yeah, I think it's an interplay of a couple of things. One, the sort of great AI rollout is one of a smaller number of unique kind of changes that employees can actively resist. Right? When you say, "Oh, we've had a reorg now," like you might not like it, but it happened, and leadership be like, "If you really don't like it, here's the door." But with changes in behavior, whether that's like documentation or sharing a desk or like embracing new tools that help you do your work, employees can very much just sort of cross their arms and be like, I don't like this, especially for many of them who still are in a stage where they view these new technologies as a direct threat to what they currently do instead of an opportunity for the things that they could never have done in the past. So that reframe is required starting point to make any progress. And maybe as a flip side to what Darren said about the consistency with the data, at the same time, I think modern organizations, as I mentioned earlier, will have to be much more fluid, almost like more power and autonomy at the edge to allow people to be responsive to customer demands, changing employee needs, fluid teams, mixed workforce models, right? Like the arms of the organization have to be much more fluid, and in doing that, have to be more resilient to constantly evolving ways of working. So core data, but even as we see like model to model to model, what worked for me in ChatGPT version 1.2.3, whatever it is today, in a week, the model changes, the behavior changes, or someone else comes up with a better mousetrap. And so the most like healthy AI transformation cultures are the ones that are like very transparent and pro sharing and pro micro learning and pro like remixing what other people are doing, which sounds crazy and terrifying. In particular to my old being in a compliance function at a Swiss bank brain of like, no, it must be controlled and there must be approvals and processes. That is not how organizations will succeed now. So you need the brain, as Darren said, like the ability to find out what is important and who does what, who is motivated by what outcomes, but still incredible autonomy in a culture of learning. And for leaders, that means like vulnerability, that there is no way you can put this all in a box and control it the way that you use it.
Yeah, one thing that I'd add on to that, Phil, I think that's so well put, is you're wasting your time just chasing the latest model and the latest layer. It changes so fast. You're wasting your time. What's going to really stand out is the boring solution. Just go back and do the first principles right, and then however the technology evolves, you're set up for it. Instead of saying like, oh, I'm good at this model and we're going to apply to it. It's like that's going to change next week.
Right.
What you would be better off doing is getting really crisp around what do roles do here? How does work happen here? How do we communicate? What project management tool do we use? How do we track these things? Those first principles on how things are documented and just really solidifying the operating system, then you can layer whatever technology comes along on top of that, and it's going to do phenomenal things. And a lot of companies right now are getting caught up in the hype of let's just get good at the latest model and thing instead of the boring approach of let's just get better at operationalizing who we are.
Yeah, and maybe I'm just sort of realizing like there's this weird inverse where companies are seeing the built environment as like the fixed thing, like put you in a box, and they view remote work, any version of you're not here right now, as this weird, chaotic anarchy of like, I don't know what's going on. And Darren, I think you and I would say, like, in order to succeed in this much more fluid and AI-powered future, you have to think of not remote, but the kind of remote first or digital first structure as where you need clarity and documentation. Like, no, that should be not same, but like consistent. And that you need to unlearn that the built environment, how we move through the world, where we go, where we see value, digital, physical, opportunistically hopping in a driverless car that takes you to like meet your client you didn't know was even in town, right? That we have to become more fluid in how we're moving, but more consistent in the sort of operating system of work itself.
Corinne probably wants to take us to another point.
Yeah, probably.
Well, I was going to just
6 minutes.
reaffirm, distributed teams is the control. Like that's where we are, whether organizations are ready for it or not. Phil, you and I would have said this in 2018 because we would look at the data and we would see only 60% of people were in the office way back then. Obviously, the data has changed a little bit more, but we've got 6 minutes left. I want to do a very quick twofer from both of you and then give the floor to, one or two final questions.
Yeah,
So
we have a good question in the chat there, Dia.
Oh, great. Hang on. Okay, so from Tace, for teams with a lot of junior or early career folks, what are the first structural things leaders should focus on so documentation and transparency actually help AI outcomes instead of just adding noise?
Yeah, look, it starts with onboarding. If you can onboard a new junior or early career hire and make it very clear to them, what is your culture? How does work happen around here? Basically give them the operating manual. You're embedding that in their mind from the start. And if they come into an organization where nothing is written down and it's all chaotic and the only way to onboard is to have 49 one-on-ones with people to extract things from them in the most inefficient way possible, guess what? Now they're going to contribute to that system. So for me, it absolutely begins at onboarding. The tone that you set is the tone that you get.
Source of truth.
What he said, onboarding. I was going to.
So you're good with that. Okay, so my twofer in the last 4 minutes is, to someone who might be in the audience or someone who might hear a playback of this down the road, and they are trying to figure out what AI they should be investing in. Quick thesis on like what you guys think what is one of those core principles, or what are one of those first principles that they should focus on, and two, what's in the great beyond that you guys are sort of seeing out of the corner of your eye that we should be keeping an eye on?
You want to start?
Sure, I'll go first. I think those that command language the best control the future. And so what you're seeing with AI is if you can clearly articulate a vision that is in your mind and convert it to words in a way that a computer can do something with it, you're essentially limitless. And this kind of goes back to the first principle of documentation. This is why it is so important. You do not need to know how to code a website or design a website. You simply need to know what good looks like and be able to tell it to a tool that can build. This is such a different way of thinking, but writing forces clarity. And that's why I would say double down on writing and making sure that your documentation is crisp, because if it is, the tools are being built by the minute that can translate that vision in your mind into something that is tangible.
Yeah.
I would say go.
And I would say, by the way, Manus is a great example of this. If you have not heard of this Manus tool, it's like a Google style front end that you can just tell things to it and it will create. And I think it's just the absolute tip of the iceberg of what's to come.
Wow.
I would add to that. Look, it's not about the tool and a hammer finding a nail. The things that have impressed me the most recently at kind of conferences and with clients are the teams that are actually taking a moment to slow back down and document how the work is done today, because then you can get people aligned on a problem that, like, here's where the toil is and there must be a solution. The solutions are easier to find than ever, but it's the alignment around the problem itself and like doing the human-centered study about how the work is done today, and then that becomes a logical path to learning about the tools that can unlock things that we can't even do. And maybe the like forward-thinking idea, in addition to just making sure you're reading books and going to conferences that are not about these two topics, like by name, AI or kind of remote or hybrid, is realizing that, like I heard a chief scientist from Microsoft say this a while ago, and it really stuck. Like, we still come from a world where we think knowledge is baked into documents and assets, things we make. We are moving into a world now where all of the knowledge is in the kind of conversation and the little breadcrumbs along the way of the decisions that we make. That is like where the agents aren't learning on all the things that we wrote before, but they're learning on what we are talking about right now. And once you start thinking about that, it's a real mind shift about the power that these tools will have to tell us the things that we don't realize that we are saying, knowing, deciding, implying, to make better work experience for us and again, better outcomes for the companies.
Awesome.
So we got a
In
minute.
under 60 seconds, anyone else have a question?
All right. With that, I just want to give a huge thank you to Corinne, Darren, Phil. Can we get everybody give some? The more you clap, the louder it gets. It's pretty awesome. Look at that. So great. I mean, theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge from some of the OGs in the future of workspace. So thanks. Huge thank you for that. And thank you to you for taking the time to spend your day with us to participate and to further this critical conversation. Also, as a thank you for attending, we've thrown everybody's LinkedIn in the chat. Please follow them and like them and buy Corinne's book. But also for you, for attending, a super special offer right now. 2 of our founders are standing by to give you a 10-minute tour of Rome. If you join the tour, you will have a blast, and we also will give you free express onboarding in addition to our 2-week free trial of Rome for your entire team. You don't want to miss this. I promise. The link's in the chat. Just click it, and like you'll see an AI-powered office of the future and how that helps productivity and culture for distributed teams throughout the world, and how Rome makes remote work. Cool. Thank you again.
Everyone.
We'll see you next time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, all.
Thanks all.